a fantastic panel of speakers who are going to be talking to you about different aspects of what they do with regards to climate and how we can all get involved. And I think, you know, there's something that every single one of us can do and make sure that we're taking the best action that we can, and also holding people in power to account on these different issues. So we're going to have 3 speakers. Each one will have about 10 minutes to do their presentations, and then we'll follow that with a Q&A. If you've got any questions, please feel free to use the chat function and add your question in there. Our Stroud District Green Party tech support will also be adding in any useful links that come up during the presentation so that you can do some extra reading or get involved in different campaigns and projects if you'd like to. If anyone's having any issues, then please feel free to get in touch with Stroud District Green Party and we'll try our best to help you. So while we do the presentations, we ask if everyone can turn off their cameras. It's been lovely to see all your smiling faces. But if we can just have our 3 presenters keep their cameras on, that would be great. So the running order for tonight is we've got Pär Holmgren first, and then Richard Lancaster, and then Rod Nelson, and I'll introduce each one as we go. So Pär Holmgren is a meteorologist and climate expert, and since 2019 has been a member of the European Parliament, working on behalf of the Swedish Green Party. He's a member of the Committee of the Environment, Public Health and Food Safety, and substitutes on the Committee of Agriculture and Rural Development as well. He's also chairing the working group for the Greens' effort on climate, which is obviously a very important role and highly relevant to the topic that we'll be talking about tonight. He was previously a captain in the Swedish Air Force and has been working as a meteorologist in Swedish television. He's an advocate for climate issues as well as a whole host of other things, and I'm sure he'll tell you a little bit more about that in his presentation. So thanks, Pär, if you'd like to kick us off.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jenny. And apart from Jenny and Molly, I guess I'm new to the rest of you, so I could give you a little bit more of a background. As Jenny said, I am a meteorologist, climate expert. My interest in climate change started, at least from a theoretical standpoint or point of view, during the years when I was a PhD student, late 80s, early 90s. And that was, of course, the same time as IPCC was founded, created, and the first report was released from IPCC. And as some of you may know, the first coordinator of IPCC was Bert Bolin, an old professor of meteorology from Sweden, whom I got to know quite well some years later when he retired from his mission at IPCC. Back then, maybe climate for me was something theoretical. It was very interesting to see these long equations and just trying to imagine what could happen sometime in the future. But then mid-90s, I became a father. I had 3 children. And then, of course, just as many other, I realized that future that up until then, maybe it was some sort of just theory in the future, suddenly became physically and literally my own children's future. So that got me moving from a more theoretical part to a much more advocate climate campaigner, or whatever you would call it. The last 4 or 5 years now, before I joined the Swedish Greens, which is just 3 years ago, I was working for the biggest insurance company in Sweden with climate change and climate adaptation issues. And that, of course, also gave me an insight of how vulnerable Sweden is, and that's the same for the rest of Europe and for the rest of the world, of course. Since I joined the Swedish Greens 3 years ago and then was elected for the European Parliament, I've been focusing, of course, mainly on climate, but also biodiversity and that sort of sustainability issues. And I once again I must say that Molly was one of those who really took good care of me when I was new in the Parliament. So big thank you again, Molly, for that. But if I focus then on the upcoming COP, why it's so important, I would really like to stress that, to me anyhow, from a mere theoretical point of view, this is definitely the last chance, I would say, that we still could be able to, at least theoretically then, have a global warming in the order of 1.5 degrees towards the end of the century. If we would do everything right from now on, maybe that's still possible. At the same time, the global warming is continuing. IPCC stressed in their report that we had 1.1 degrees of global warming in the middle of the last decade, and the global warming rate is a little bit more than 0.2 degrees per decade, which means that we now, in the beginning of the 2020s, are slightly above 1.2 degrees, and that we unfortunately will reach 1.5 degrees already in the beginning of next decade, as the global warming rate is accelerating as long as we continue to increase and strengthen the greenhouse effect. So it is impossible, totally impossible to maintain the warming below 1.5 degrees permanently, but still with real climate action and a real transition of our society towards renewables and of course planting trees and, you know, everything that we need to do, then it's still theoretically possible then to get this temperature curve down towards 1.5 degrees again around 2100. But there is really a lot of things that we need to do, and of course, as I said, looking from my own personal point of view, this is no longer something theoretical that may happen in the future. It is already happening, as Jenny said this summer. Once again, for us here on the Northern Hemisphere, we were reminded all over the Northern Hemisphere, heat waves, droughts, heavy rain showers and severe floodings, etc. And that is just what we could expect, of course, because the more heat, the more energy we get into the atmosphere and the oceans, the faster the cycle of water, the hydrological cycle will get. And that give us more severe drought and more severe floodings, not at the same time at the same place, but at the same time in different places. So to reach that, of course, we really need to have all sectors on a 1.5 degree pathway, and that is, of course, different focus areas then for different countries, different parts of the world. Back home in Sweden, it's definitely the transport sector that needs the fast transition. All over Europe, especially in the eastern part of Europe, we still have a huge use of carbon, and of course, from a bigger perspective, the climate issue is, after all, quite easy. It's in the end, it's all about keeping the fossils in the ground. But in the eastern part of Europe, we have the problem with a lot of coal-fired power plants that then need to be replaced. It's the same in some other parts of the world as well, of course, like Australia, etc. And usually we have the situation where countries like Sweden, like UK and Germany and a few others, if we're just looking at the more rich part of the world, are doing some good stuff, I would say, after all, but usually not enough. And we're still in this situation where we often tend to blame the problems on other parts of the world. When it comes to the European Union, you often hear the Commission talk about climate leadership, especially then, of course, Ursula von der Leyen and Frans Timmermans, who likes to, I would almost say, pretend that we are on the right path, but unfortunately we're not at all on the right path, not even us here in the best parts of Europe. And when we look at the scrutination, is that the right English word? You understand what I mean. When you look in detail at the different NDCs, what the different countries have said that they will achieve during the next few decades and during this century, we're roughly, at least, on a path towards something in the order of 3 degrees of global warming by the end of the century. And that huge gap is, of course, the same sort of huge gap that we still have, unfortunately, between science and politics. And the problem with climate change, and it's the same, of course, with loss of biodiversity, is that as long as we're not doing enough, then this gap between science and politics will only get wider and wider. That is not the case in most other political issues. Maybe if you have a goal that you should achieve something by 2030 and you're not doing enough for the first 5 years, then maybe you can do a bit more the last 5 years. But when it comes to climate change, it's really not about the emissions currently this year or next year. It's about the total amount of emissions that we've done already since mid-18th century. So we're talking about emissions that has been too high for a period of at least 200 years now. And that has given us, especially during the last 30 years, an increased greenhouse effect. So in the end, we need to have a climate neutral, fossil-free world, but we also need to make sure that we get these carbon sinks. And some parts of the society, some political parties maybe dream of some sort of science fiction, high technology answer somewhere, sometime in the future. But to be realistic, the only way we can create these carbon sinks and negative emissions here and now is actually in forestry and agriculture. And then when we're doing that, we need also to recognize the important interlinkage to biodiversity. So we mustn't just focus on one issue at a time. That was roughly what I wanted to say during these first 10-15 minutes. I noted there was a question in the chat, but maybe I can answer that later.
Thanks,
you
Pär.
decide, Jenny.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great way of kicking us off, and you know, a fantastic overview. I think you make some very good points. One around transition looking different for every single country, not just for Europe, but across the world. Not only are people experiencing climate change differently, there's some of the most affected areas and most affected people are those outside of the European Union or European continent, but also the resources they have to tackle this looks very different as well. So I think that you're right, we need to look at this as a world and as an entire people and work with each other on the different solutions before the inequality gets much bigger, not just between science and politics, but between, you know, activists and politicians, and also between the different countries and how they can approach this. So we'll leave the questions for the end, but I mean, feel free to write anything in the chat as we go. I'm sure people will be interested to hear your view like that as well. So our second speaker is Richard Lancaster, and Richard is a Greenpeace activist and retired software engineer. He's been a member of Greenpeace for over 30 years and dedicates his free time to campaigning, giving environmental talks, and working with different educational establishments. He originally joined Greenpeace to support an anti-whaling campaign, which I know, you know, if that was 30 years ago, how relevant that still is. There's a lot of stuff in the news right now about whaling and dolphin killing, and I don't even know what else around the world. So yeah, still a big issue, but convinced that climate change is the biggest challenge that we face right now as a people. So Richard, if you'd like to kick us off again, and your 10 minutes starts now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Climate denialism, claiming that the climate isn't warming or that human activity isn't a factor, is now, politically speaking, on the verge of extinction. Those politicians who meet in Glasgow don't need to be persuaded over climate change. They get it because their voters get it, and poll after poll shows Western publics accept that mankind is contributing to a changing climate and that we must change our ways. And politicians are ultimately the servants of such opinions. And around the world, leaders have largely accepted the need to decarbonise, setting goals of various ambition to reduce or eliminate net carbon emissions. And as I'm sure you know, the UK's is a target for 2050. But just because people have accepted that we need to do something about the climate, doesn't mean that they're signed up for all that this entails. Voters, as you know, are a tricky lot, able to demand something whilst also resisting the costs and changes needed to deliver it. So people who demand action on climate change may still balk at flying and driving less, eating less meat, or swapping their gas central heating for a heat pump. So the challenge for the politicians at COP26 is how to make it easier for people to accept the changes needed to decarbonise. So in many countries, that means finding ways to support the workers and the communities that, as Pär said, still rely on coal as that fuel is phased out. Now in the UK, which is all but done with coal, it's about supporting changes in our transport, homes and behaviour, and in the most carbon intensive industries. So, for example, Greenpeace, who I work with, is now working with UK oil workers on policies and practical actions to help them retrain and find jobs in other sectors. So what hope is there for COP26? Well, as Pär said, the COP26 is the deadline for countries to present their plans to cut emissions. Together, these plans need to set the world on track to stop the global temperature rising, as Pär again said, by 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. Now, despite being on the official agenda, these plans are very unlikely to be delivered. And the other challenge is that the International Energy Agency, just today, was stating that their current calculations say that the plans that are in place will see us fall 60% short of the 2050 net zero target. And for COP26 to be a real success, leaders need to go beyond commitments that they've already made and back up their promises with concrete national plans, policies, and investments. And the IEA estimates that $4 trillion is needed over the next decade. So, for example, every country needs to stop all new fossil fuel projects immediately and to stop burning coal altogether. And rich nations need to give extra financial support to poorer countries to do the same and to help them deal with the existing impacts of climate change. Now, rules for carbon markets are also on the agenda for COP26. And carbon markets, as I'm sure you are all aware, give countries and companies a free pass to pollute through things like carbon offsetting. These complex discussions threaten to swamp the negotiations, leaving little room for more urgent agreements on climate finance and the phasing out of fossil fuels. Instead of getting bogged down in carbon markets, governments need to focus on making firm rules for companies to reduce emissions directly from their activities. Now, Greenpeace will be sending representatives to COP because it's important to have experts, campaigners, and those on the front lines of the climate crisis in the negotiations. They'll be observing, making contributions, and making sure that the politicians are listening. And Greenpeace is also supporting grassroots groups and helping representatives such as Indigenous leaders to attend COP. Many such communities from the global south are often the most exposed to climate impacts such as fires and floods, despite being the least responsible. And decisions made at COP26 will therefore affect them most directly. As a global organisation, Greenpeace is also working to influence COP from the outside. This means working with activists across the world, helping them to put pressure on leaders to push for the best outcome in the negotiations. If you want to get involved in Glasgow, London, and in cities throughout the UK, there will be marches on Saturday, the 6th of November. And Greenpeace, I'm sure, will also be doing what it does best, some direct action. So you can rest assured that despite the unprecedented levels of security that will be surrounding COP26, I'm sure there will be some bold and imaginative actions. But of course, I can't tell you what they'll be because I don't know. But what I can say is they will be specifically aimed at the COP26 delegates. And this is where I just wanted to explore the fact that noisy demonstrations that cause massive public disruption might have worked when this was a fight about the big picture of climate science. But it's arguable that they're probably now doing more harm than good. And I'd say a good test of any political activity is to ask, how is this persuading people who don't agree with me to support my cause? Now, I hesitate to criticize other environmental groups, but it is arguable, for example, that Insulate Britain's repeated blocking of the M25 fails that test of persuading people who don't agree with you to support your cause. Climate politics is now all about implementation, and politicians need help in making the friction and change involved in decarbonisation acceptable and even beneficial to voters. Some commentators argue that focusing campaign efforts on the actions of individuals simply makes people feel guilty while acting as a distraction from the role of the big polluters in driving climate change and the need for wider system change driven by governments. This is particularly true in the context of big international events like COP26. And the social science of climate change engagement shows that individual change is an integral part of system change in driving social shifts, influencing governments, and in wider climate advocacy. But on the other side of the coin, it also shows that governments need to focus efforts on empowering individuals to take action in their lives for system change to happen. I mean, we know that one person adopting a new behavior, like putting up solar panels or adopting a vegetarian diet, often prompts others to do the same. And people are profoundly influenced by the behaviors of the people around them, particularly those they view as similar to themselves. And on a social level, there may be unexpected tipping points in which a large enough minority of people doing things differently is able to bring about wider cultural change. And this process is also important as a way of influencing governments. Politicians in democratic systems need evidence of social consent in order to introduce radical policy change. I mean, unpopular climate policies have threatened the survival of governments in the past. And even seemingly win-win technologies and ideas, such as free home insulation schemes, are not taken up if they're unpopular or if people view them as irrelevant. As Pär said, people living in the richer countries have a particularly significant role to play. Households in the top 10% of income earners around the world use nearly half of all the energy used for land transport and 3/4 of all energy used for flying. And these households, which include a significant proportion in the UK and the EU, will need to make major contributions to reducing emissions. And lifestyle change is an important part of system change. But short-term and voluntary effort by individuals isn't going to be sufficient to achieve the radical emissions reductions we need. People are willing to make change, but governments need to create the conditions under which lifestyle changes are possible. Citizens who undertake personal lifestyle change may then go on to advocate for system change if they're given the support. And also, they're also more convincing to others because they're seen to be acting in line with their beliefs and values. Now, when we're talking about advocates for climate change, Climate Outreach have done lots of research on how to engage the British public on climate change. Their segmentation research reveals a public that is fractured, but actually it's not deeply polarized, with climate change emerging as an issue that has the potential to unite us. But building narratives that resonate with a diverse range of values and everyday concerns is critical for the long-term goal of deepening public engagement and keeping it there. But there has been some good news on this front. It appears we might be pushing at an open door as far as the public, at least in the UK, is concerned. Almost 22,000 people chose their favoured mix of policies to hit the government's 2030 targets. And surprisingly, they back carbon tax on polluting industries, higher levels on flying and particularly frequent flyers, and grants for heat pumps in order to tackle the climate crisis. They were also advocating for a speed limit of 60 miles an hour on motorways and a campaign to reduce meat eating by 10%. And all of these had support of between 77 and 94%. And interestingly, age, location, and even political leaning made little difference to the policy choices the researchers found, with an overwhelming consensus for strong and fair climate action. The report, which was the biggest analysis of public policy preferences ever published, was produced by the WWF and the think tank Demos. And the other key thing about all of this is who people trust as giving the message. And on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being the least trustworthy and 5 being the most, it's a little surprise David Attenborough comes out on top at over 4, followed at around 3 by Chris Packham, Prince William, Michaela Strachan, Prince Charles, Greta Thunberg. While at the other end of the scale, with a score hovering around 1, the bottom 3 were the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, the President of COP, Alok Sharma, and the Prime Minister himself. So to summarize, firstly, we probably need to stop calling it COP26 and start calling it the UN Climate Change Conference. And that's for 2 reasons. Because first of all, nobody knows what COP stands for. And secondly, because the number 26 makes it sound as if it's just another in a long sequence and hence not individually that important. Secondly, we need to make sure we start conversations with anybody who will listen, explaining why the conference is important and how they can get involved. And also, don't be afraid of using rhetoric. And by that, I mean using arguments that will resonate with your audience. Put crudely, that means emphasizing things like climate justice when addressing a broadly left-wing audience, and things like British green jobs if the audience is more to the right. And finally, we need to lead by example. People taking action in their personal lives are more likely to persuade others that wider change is needed. when interacting with people, those who are perceived as living and walking the walk as well as talking the talk are far more convincing, because they're perceived as being genuine and not hypocrites. And finally, remember that the optimism of the action is much better than the pessimism of the thought. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Richard. That was brilliant, some fantastic points that you've made. And I mean, just to pull out a few, I think the conversation that you're having there on how we make it relevant to different groups of people and knowing your audience when you're trying to give a rhetoric that they can engage with is vitally important. I think that people who, you know, can't put food on the table or are working 5 jobs or whatever it might be, find it much more difficult to understand why small individual changes like recycling or using your car less are important. So I think that is a really creating a narrative that people can engage with and people can get on board with is something that the left and the climate, I guess, justice activists are really struggling with, I think, which is something that's really important. I think you made some other fantastic points around protest and what's the right way to protest, I guess you could say, like what works these days in terms of getting people on board with the agenda. And another few important points specifically about COP around polluters and their representation at the COP. I think that's a big question at the minute. There's a big campaign around polluters out. Is it important for people like BP and Shell to actually have a seat at the table so that they know, you know, what they've been a part of and how we plan on changing the future, or should they not even be there at all because they're a massive part of the problem? So I think that there are a lot of big questions for people to think about, and hopefully our audience will have some fantastic questions for you following that. So thank you very much. So moving on to our final speaker, we've got Rod Nelson, who is bringing the local perspective for Stroud, who lives near Nailsworth and is a practicing artist and woodblock printmaker. He's taught nationally and internationally and became interested in environmental issues when studying natural sciences. He was one of the OGs voting for the Ecology Party at the election in 1974, so been interested in this for a while. And as sort of his interest came from, you know, where does the wood come from that I'm using, and from that got involved in reforestation programs in northern Thailand. So is an international player in the game as well. He's also been involved in the Soil Association and a whole host of other fantastic projects. So Rod, if you'd like to unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself and how this is important for the climate and COP.
Thank you very much indeed. You've bigged me up considerably there. This is going to be slightly different from previous talks because some of it is going to be very subjective. I'm afraid I was asked to report on my feelings about going to COP23 in Bonn. There are some, just the starting point as time frame. I was at a meeting at university in 1972 when somebody at the meeting raised the idea that the contribution of atmospheric carbon could change the climate, and was more or less shouted down as being unrealistic. And I was interested in this. I mean, I didn't know anything. I'm not a meteorologist or a climatologist or a physicist, but hearing this reaction interested me. And I, at the time I was studying architecture, and there
Hi, Rod, are you still there?
interest then in
Back
and
again.
a couple at the university. Sorry, there was pioneering work done at the university on low impact housing. So this is going back 50 years. This issue has been afloat. In the billing for me at this for this presentation, it was asked. It was said that I would contribute the purpose of COP, well, I don't think I need to contribute that. I think everybody here will know that. The next question that I was billed to answer was how it works. Well, the key acronym seems to be, to me, NDC, which is the nationally declared contribution, which is the commitment that each country is making. And the linchpin of the whole of the COP is going to be around these NDCs and the review of the commitments that are made by each country, and the kind of overall perspective of how progress or not progress is being made on this issue. And the third question I was given was, who will be there? Well, I've only got the Bonn COP23 to go on, but this is my take on that. There are the parties, because it's the conference of the parties, which are the governments, their governments and their government delegations. But also there are NGOs, expert groups, lobbyists, bankers, energy companies, salesmen, mountebanks, playwrights, consultants, indigenous people groups, academic organizations, artists, thinkers, salesmen, visionaries, and prophets. There's the whole world is there, and it's a great swirl. And anyway, I'll go, now I'm going to take a jump now. I was a member of the Green Economics Institute, which is a very interesting organization in Oxford. Anybody can join, and they have conferences and discussions about economics and all sorts of things. Anyway, I joined, and shortly afterwards that I was aware that there was a spare ticket that was going for Bonn COP23. And I thought, okay, I've got friends in Germany, I can combine it with it. So my partner and I, we drove to Aachen and stayed with some friends, and Bonn is just down the road. And I just wanted to, while I'm talking, I'm going to show one or two of the drawings that I've done. Am I allowed to share my screen?
If you can't already, then I'm sure our technical support will be making that happen in the background.
I just wonder if I can. Okay. Yeah, hang on a sec. Let's try. Now, that's not the one I wanted. I thought I would. That's the one I want to share. No, it's not letting me pick the. If I can't do these shares, this is going to be a bit difficult, because one of the things that I did at COP was I was very keen to have a kind of graphical. No.
It does say that you've started sharing your screen.
Does it come up? What's the image you have?
There's no image yet.
There's no image. Okay.
Apologies. It would have been lovely to have sort of an artistic side of.
Yes, because my drawings were quite important part of this this show. Look, anyway, I tell you what, I won't bother about that. I'll just go on, but it'll truncate my talk to some extent. So I arrived in Bonn after driving through, more or less from leaving Stroud to London and Dover, and then from Dunkirk through to Aachen via Brussels. I was on motorways that were just jammed from end to end with lorries and cars, a huge rumbling mass of carbon burning thing. And as we went into Germany, this great procession of vehicles was going underneath the windmills that were turning above. And I was kind of struck with a kind of, I don't know, it didn't give me a good feeling. I felt we're in the middle of this amazing energy consumption juggernaut, and we're part of it. I am part of it. So anyway, I got to Bonn, and I was part of the Green Economics Institute stand. So I had a place I could stand and gather. And sometimes I was free and sometimes I was not. I was talking to all sorts of people there, almost all of them very interesting, highly qualified, people of tremendous goodwill and enjoyable company. So it was a nice place for me to be. It was hugely international, people from all over the world. And there were three things I wanted to talk about. One was there was a forestry day, and I've got some specialist understanding of aspects of forestry. I'm not a forester, but I was involved with wood, and I have been all my life. And in 1994, I got a job at the Soil Association, to cut a long story short, working with market mechanisms to promote responsible forestry. And through that, I got to lots of conferences, both in England and in Europe, in Sweden, in Germany, and in Africa. I was sent to these places, and a fantastic privilege to get to hear this aspect of human activity laid out as it was. And it was not encouraging what I was hearing. When I went to this forestry day at the COP, I was immediately thrown back into 1994. I'd never been to a conference before, and the words were the same, the language was the same, the people were the same. So I went through a kind of personal time warp that was actually quite depressing, because I felt, actually, I was hearing this then, and it's in many ways got worse since then. We're looking at terrible, difficult things going on in the Amazon and all over the tropical forests, and it's really a tricky, area. And yeah, so I didn't feel any kind of massive sense of uplift from that. The second meeting I wanted to describe a little bit was, this was a bit of luck. I think I stumbled by accident into a rather important room where there were high-level representatives from the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, from Shell, from the European Development Bank, Pricewaterhouse, World Bank, about three others, and I can't remember. I don't have my notes. All I have is my memories. These people were high up in important organizations, and my brain being limited, I only managed to remember 2 points which go back to that time. One of those points was around a notion called stranded assets, which is very, very crucial. It basically, up till recently, investment in oil and fossil fuels has been an absolute solid investment, and huge amounts of money have been invested by pension funds and local authorities, government bodies, as well as charitable organizations, have invested in fossil fuel companies. With the change that this initiative to reduce carbon emissions is concerned, these assets become, in inverted commas, stranded, i.e., they're not valuable assets anymore. They're just, you're turning huge amounts of money into lead. It's no more money, it's dead. And that scares the bankers no end. And this meeting kind of woke me up to the fact that there's a huge, as well as technical difficulties, there's huge financial difficulties to these changes. The second point that came out of that meeting was in regard to electrification. And the guy from Shell, who actually I thought was quite impressive, He was their environmental manager, and I can't remember his name, but he's written books around this. He was saying that the rate of that fundamental change within society relies on electrification. And the rate of electrification, again, I'm making up this figure, but I don't think I'm far wrong. This is what my memory is. He said the rate of additional electrification at the moment, i.e. 2017, was 3% every 10 years. He said that is far, far too slow. You know, if we're going to really make these changes, it's got to go hugely up. Anyway, I thought I'll throw that into the mixture. The last thing I was wanting to raise was the director of the Green Economics Institute, called Miriam.
Are you still there, Rod? Sorry, we seem to, we seem to have got you on a pause there, Rod. Hopefully Rod will come back in a second. And when he does, I will absolutely stop talking, but a fantastic personal perspective.
She's a character. Oh. She's a great time. And she, can you hear me? Whoops.
Yeah, you're back here. Don't worry, you're back in, Rod. We can hear you now.
She said, we're going to revolve our campaign around 2 tons. That is 2 tons of carbon dioxide per person on Earth, right? And we've got to talk about it. She said, you're members of the Institute, you've got to follow the party line. Well, as an individualist, I went, you know, I don't like this much. But what happened was very, very interesting. Suddenly, what we were talking about with this 2 tons was of great interest to people from India, from people from China, to people from the Maldives, from small nation states, because they're not using anything like 2 tons. We, on the other hand, are using 11 tons, right? And I looked at my own carbon, I did my own carbon audit, pretty rough and ready, but I did my best based on my bills and everything. And it was coming out at around 11 tons. So I'm probably no better, no worse than the average Tom, Dick or Harry here. Anyway, I thought what Miriam had done was actually very, very interesting. It had really provoked a serious debate. We have got to cut our energy bills at a personal level by 4/5 if we're going to get near to the kind of figures that she's talking about. And her figures are based on meteorological calculations and goodness knows what, all sorts of technical stuff that she goes into. So finally, I think that's, yeah. I went, when I got to COP, I was fairly pessimistic. When I left, I was uplifted by the people, but even more pessimistic. I came across one technological thing that I thought was very interesting, which I haven't heard discussed. And I'd be interested in feedback on this. It was an idea that came, I think, from an Australian I was talking to, who said that the solar potential of Australia is so great that if it was possible to harvest the sunlight falling on Australia, the calculations show that a single day of solar energy acquisition in Australia would power China for a year. So Australia is getting enough electricity to power China every day. But of course, it's not being harvested. And the Chinese are interested in this notion because they are looking at methods of long distance, ultra high voltage, direct current transmission with the idea of harvesting energy in the desert and transmitting it to areas where the energy is needed. And I thought this actually does look interesting. I don't know whether anybody's an expert on this. I've done a little bit of looking into it. I think I'll end there. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you so much, Rod. And I'm sure that we've got a whole host of experts in the room who would be interested in talking about the power of solar and renewable energy. Thank you very much for bringing that personal perspective on COP to the evening, to the Cloud Cafe. Some, again, fantastic points that you've made around, especially for me, around finance. And I think that that is a big driving factor of climate change. I think there'll always be greedy people in this world who need more than everybody else. But I always think, why can you not make money from good things instead of from bad things? And hopefully, as the money starts to move, action will start to be easier for those kinds of people. So thank you to all of our three speakers. I think we've had three totally different perspectives brought to the table tonight, but I think that there's been some key themes that have run through all three of the talks, specifically around inequality and the growing inequalities and how climate change is affecting different groups of people around the world and their ability to act on those things with the resources that they have available to them. I think the second thing is around the fact that we've been talking about this for 50 plus years, that we can all together remember, and the talk is not enough anymore. And I think, you know, recently I was at the global climate strikes with thousands of young people marching through Köln in Germany, and that is their message, that this is not enough anymore, and that the time for talk is well and truly over, and that now we need to take collective action to tackle climate change. So we've had loads of fantastic chat going on while you've been speaking, and I'm going to pull a few of the questions out now so that we can continue this discussion. So the first question that I think was maybe mentioned by Richard is from Sarah Tum. Sarah, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, if you're there. If not, I can ask the question. The question is around meat eating. So I guess Richard mentioned it, but I guess the bigger question might be around individual action versus sort of government and corporation action. So, okay, Pär, if you'd like to come in on that first.
Yeah, of course, we need to cut quite drastically when it comes to meat consumption. But when we're doing that, it's also important to cut the bad types of meat, the industrial, the cheap meat. In a country like Sweden, especially in the north of Sweden, it's quite tricky actually to grow vegetables or almost anything, but you have huge areas for grazing reindeers, sheep, etc. So I usually say that we probably need in Europe and UK to cut the meat eating by, let's say, 75% or something on an average. But the remaining 25% can actually do a lot of good, especially when it comes to biodiversity. And once again, we mustn't forget the connection between biodiversity and climate.
Thank you very much. Anybody else like to come in on that? Richard, maybe?
No, I mean, obviously, the key damaging factor in that is the industrial meat. You know, the fact that, you know, it's not all the vegetarians and vegans in Britain that are eating the soya. It's all of the soya, but 90% imported from the Amazon is being fed to chickens and pigs. You know, and if you see the thing, it's like, you know, of all the living things on the planet, it's like 38% are humans, 4% are wild animals, and, you know, 60 or 70% are you know, are livestock for us to eat. So, you know, I mean, obviously I'm a vegetarian, but I don't anticipate that everyone's going to become a vegetarian or vegan overnight. But if we, you know, reduce the amount of meat, and especially cut out the industrial meat, and eat better quality meat, those who want to eat better quality meat, once or twice a week, grass fed in this country, not fed on imported soya from the Amazon, then that will certainly help.
Thank you both. I think I'm going to move on because we've got so many fantastic questions, and Rod will pull you in on the next one. So Wendy Thomas, your question is next, if you're there.
Do you mean Thompson?
Oh, sorry. Yes, I do mean
That's all
Thompson.
right. I just got to go back and remember. What was my question?
So it's at 8:51 around how can we best achieve?
Yeah. I think a couple of suggestions which I've actually put down, but I'm just working at the sort of local level, you know, within the Stonehouse Climate Action Group, and for me, it's how can I get more people to collaborate together? But how can we then move that on to make sure that everybody is collaborating as much as they can? So any other tips? I know it has already been suggested, but any other ways that our speakers can reassure me?
Thanks, Wendy. Hands up for the speakers who wants to join in.
I
Okay,
didn't hear the
Oh.
question, so because my connection died.
Oh, right. Sorry, Rod. It was just around basically how can, you know, small scale activism involve bigger groups of people. But we can go to Pär first, and then we can come to you after that, Rod, if you like.
Yeah, I think Richard discussed this very, very well. As you mentioned also, Richard, that there's more or less no climate denial left, more or less. But there is a huge amount of what I usually call response denial. There's a lot of people talking, but not actually acting. And to make sure that we reach this critical mass of enough of people wanting to see a change, and also changing in a way their own lives, but particularly helping move and change the society. I think that we as Greens must be better storytellers and really get ordinary people, or enough of people, to really long for a sustainable and just future. I think we need to be better in visualizing that vision that may be obvious for us, but we need to be better storytellers and help some of the people out there to connect the dots and make them realize that whatever they do, small or big, it's still moving, hopefully at least, the society in the right direction.
Thanks. Rod, did you want to respond to that question?
Well, just a very small one. I agree very much with the idea of stories. They resonate. The lessons of politics in Britain is that emotion triumphs fact all the time. And the kind of stories that are not getting out are, for instance, ones that I feel are terribly important, like, you know, the rate of private flying is at an all-time high in Britain at the moment, which kind of beggars my imagination, you know, but it's true.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so Richard, and then I can see a hand up from Jan. So after we've been to Richard, we will bring Jan in.
Yeah, I think you know, Pär's right about the storytelling, but it has to be phrased in the right way. So the first thing is that if you go to the point where you make it sound so bad that there's nothing to be done, and in fact what we're finding now, as Pär also alluded to, is that there aren't so much climate denial now, but people are saying it's too late, so there's no point doing anything. So that sort of paralyzes people, and so you get inaction that way. So you can't get to the point where it's project fear, to a point where people think there's literally nothing to be done, there's no point doing anything. And also you still do need to phrase it, uncomfortable as it may be, but I keep stressing this, phrase it for the story for the audience. So as I say, if you talk to a broadly right-wing audience, you can talk about climate justice for the most poor and vulnerable in the other side of the world, and it's going to go straight over their heads. But if you talk about British jobs for British people in the green industries, making us less dependent on foreign imports of oil and energy, then that will resonate. And you may be uncomfortable as Greens making that message across, but unfortunately, there's a lot of people who that's their start point. So you do need to, the story has to be tailored for the audience.
Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you so much, Richard. Jan, I see your hand's gone down. Shout if you'd like to come in on that specific question. If not, I'll move on to the next question. Okay, I'm going to ask Carol then to come in and ask your question.
Hi, everyone. I don't think I expressed my question very well. I think what I was trying to get at was, how do we stop, first of all, government saying what we've got to do is persuade people to do this, or quite often persuade companies to do that, and get over the message that actually they have got to grasp the nettle and actually legislate and force things to happen. And sort of linked to that, how do we stop all the buck passing? Because governments specialise in buck passing. It's always somebody else's fault or somebody else who's got to do it, whether it be ordinary people, private companies, or China quite often. How do we get around that one?
Thanks, Carol. Any of our speakers want to come in on that specifically?
Well, I'm happy to say that bluntly, politicians and those standing for office have to be persuaded that they're not going to get elected unless they support those policies. So at the end of the day, it is making sure that your local representatives are aware that this matters to you, it matters to the people in their street and in their constituency. That you know, at the end of the day, there's no getting around that basic connection and that basic communication of the fact that, you know, politicians react to what they believe their electorate feels strongly about. So you have to make them aware that you feel strongly about it, and as many people as possible feel strongly about it.
Absolutely. Get your voice heard, tell them what you think. Be brutally honest at this point, I think, is the situation we find ourselves in. Okay, Pär, if you'd like to come in.
Yeah, what Carol is asking and saying is definitely I would say a part of that response denialism, is it called that? Denial, that I mentioned earlier, and I think this is typical for on a European scale, the bigger political parties, the blocks of the bigger political parties, they realize that they need to talk about climate, but on the other hand, they do not want to see a huge transition of the whole society. So in their point of view, it's good if we talk about individual responsibility, that we should eat a little bit less meat, and we should change our cars into electrically driven cars, etc. But that won't give us the necessary transition of the whole society that we need, like moving towards a donut economy, or other types of changing the financial system that me and Molly have discussed quite a lot during recent time. So in a way, of course, it is important that each and one of us are responsible in our acts, and especially if that can affect other people around us. But there's a risk also that if we think that it would be enough with some people eating less meat or whatever, then we're probably in a sort of denial of the bigger transformation of the whole society that we need especially if we want to do this in a just way. And that is, it's something that a few of you others have mentioned. I forgot to mention it in my first speech, but for me, that is very, very important to make a just transition.
Absolutely. Okay, Richard, if you'd like to come in on that.
Very, very quickly. I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago when we had a stall down in Bristol with Kerry McCarthy, MP for Bristol East. And I asked her she wanted to tell me all about what the Labour Party's policies and were doing. I wasn't interested in that. What I asked her was what was the mood in the House of Commons generally about climate change and the coming COP. And she said that although the majority of MPs get it, still they think that they're doing something positive if they say, I'd like to commend, St. John's Primary School for sending me a poster about climate change. That's the kind of level that they're working at still. And we need to kind of kick them out of that mindset.
Could I just say one thing?
Yeah, of course, Rod, thanks.
One of the things that is abiding in my memory is talking to the kids who were on the school climate strike, who came out in the street, who put themselves on the roundabouts around Stroud, against initially a lot of opposition from their teachers and from, some of these kids were really struggling to do what they'd done. Some didn't know anything. So it was like a spectrum, but it makes me feel that initiative at the level of the 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds, including their teachers, is one area that this really needs to be focused on, because they are the next generation and they have got the right to have far more of a voice than they have at the moment. And I thought that what they did with those demonstrations was fantastic. And I'd like to almost see that as a permanent feature.
Absolutely. And it's fantastic that now post-COVID, these marches and actions and things by the young people across the world are starting to take place again, and they're feeling like they're finding their voice again after what has been a very difficult year, not just for young people, but for everybody. And I think you're right, it's vitally important that they have the opportunity to do that and are supported by, absolutely everybody in doing that.
Absolutely.
I think it's been interesting, some of the conversation in the chat around sort of like the individual versus government corporation, like we were just talking about. I'm going to use my position as chair just to talk a little bit about some hidden facts that recently I found out about, how we're doing a big campaign at the minute at work on bottom trawling, and how actually that releases more carbon than the entire aviation system put together. So when we talk about reduction in flights or personal carbon emissions or anything, and you think about those kinds of things that are going on in the background that might not be front and foremost in people's minds, but are actually causing huge damage to the climate as well. I think that's what the kind of systemic changes that our panelists have been talking about. It's transport, it's agriculture on these mass scales that we still have at the minute that definitely need looking at. Okay, I'm going to bring Gary Luff in because you had a question that I'm sure will be probably Rod will be very interested in.
I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that we do wait until the consequences are so bad that people feel like they need to act, but I'm just interested in how big a gap there is. We saw in the German elections the Greens do pretty well, not as well as they might have done at one stage, but they did pretty well. Against that, I look back at Australia 2 or 3 years ago when they had wildfires and still elected the Liberals and the Conservatives there. I'm just wondering if there's a view about how close the consequences are to causing a change, and sometimes we just don't know how close we are to a transition, whether we're that close or not. And I was interested if there were views on that.
Thanks, Gary. Anybody like to come in on that first? Pär, if you'd like to come in.
Yeah, I can start by just reasoning from a meteorological climate point of view, and as I see it, the one of the huge problems we have is the slowness of the climate system to respond to our emissions. As I said, we're already at 1.2 degrees, and even if we would have a full stop tomorrow, then the global warming would still continue for at least a few decades. So we would still reach 1.5 degrees, at least for a short while, even with full stop tomorrow. And once we reach 1.5 degrees, and of course we won't have a full stop tomorrow. So in other words, all the climate experts that I talk to agree that we will reach 2 degrees. Maybe then we could, as I mentioned, decrease the warming towards the end of the century. But at least during a brief period, we will reach 2 degrees. And at that level, there is the risk of carbon release from the oceans, from the tundra, and other feedback issues in the climate system. And when it comes to certain aspects of climate change, like rising sea levels, that will continue for centuries ahead. Probably 1,000 years from now, the sea levels will still continue to rise, even if we would stop the emissions tomorrow. And this is a lot of this, I fear, most people do not yet understand. Probably a lot of people think that if we lower the emissions, then the temperatures would decrease. But no, they would continue to increase, although a bit slower. A lot of people probably think that, well, if we reach some sort of climate neutrality with no emissions at all, then the temperature will stop to increase. But no, it will continue to increase for at least a few years or maybe a decade until we reach some sort of new equilibrium. And this is also part of the storytelling that I must say that me and my colleagues as meteorologists and climate experts have failed to make people really understand, once again, this huge gap between science and politics. And in other words, to answer your question more directly, yes, there is a huge risk that we will reach sometime in the future a situation where everyone more or less understands this is happening, we need to do something. And then when we do everything, it's still a few decades ahead when it still will be worse. So yeah, unfortunately, that is also, of course, what will happen once we reach 1.5 or 2 degrees. Then we will have this critical mass of enough of people, and of course also all the young in the Greta generation. By then they will be grown-ups and will be able to make the decisions that, of course, my generation should have taken already. A long answer, but an important question for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Pär. Anybody else like to come in on that? Richard?
Only to say that I give a lot of talks in schools, and I have to say that when I first started giving them, I felt I was imparting information that they didn't already know. But these days, when I go in, I feel that they are already well aware of not only climate change, but deforestation, overfishing, plastic pollution. Youngsters get it. They are, so the hope for the future is that the youngsters do understand and know, they have a much broader knowledge, all of them, than adults often do.
A very good question there. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Molly to come in and just give us a quick summary of the conversation that's going on around carbon tax, stranded assets, the economy. You seem like a good candidate to do that.
Look, Jenny, I can't say anything at the moment except carbon tax, carbon tax. I'm just on that single jag at the moment. But what was really encouraging was that survey that Richard mentioned, where 94% supported a carbon tax. And that's really astonishing because it does mean higher prices. And obviously with our policy, we would give all the money that we got from the polluting fossil fuel companies back to people to insulate their homes and cheaper public transport and all that kind of thing. But on the other finance stuff, I was going to suggest maybe we do a future one on that and talk more about that, because there is a lot of chat there, and the whole issue of stranded assets and the sustainable finance stuff I worked on in the Parliament is, yeah, it's kind of a lot of what COP's going to be about, and there is a lot of scammery going on, but there's also a lot of potential and promise there, I would say. But I'm you know, it's late and I'm tired and there's a lot to say, so let's do it another time. But everybody should say carbon tax every day to 5 different people. That's all I can say to you from now until COP. And every day I tweet something about the carbon tax. It's just not being discussed at all. And bloody Johnny Diamond on the World at Weekend on Saturday said nothing about it. And then, well, of course, people wouldn't want a carbon tax. It's just ridiculous. Most people know it's the policy we need. Yeah, anyway, enough said. It's frustrating.
Absolutely. So discussion to be continued. Watch this space. You'll have to all come to all of our other cloud cafes now just to make sure that you get part of that conversation. But I think that is interesting. I don't know if anyone of our panelists has anything that they could very quickly say on sort of following that discussion on the Energy Charter Treaty. So this is something that I've just learned about again at work. Around corporations have the ability to sue governments if their industry, however polluting or awful to our environment, goes under or becomes part of the transition. And I just wonder if anybody knows anything about that they could share with us.
Sounds dark.
It's very dark, Rod, and it's very unknown. I had literally never heard of it. And the way that it's, you know, said, it doesn't actually sound like a bad thing. Energy Charter Treaty, that sounds like, you know, nations working together on energy or something. So the way that they've branded it is very, very sneaky, but Google it. Everyone have a Google. And maybe it's something that can come into Molly's future discussion if we don't have any comments on it now. But yeah, have a look at it. Go on then, Pär, thanks.
I could just say a few words that it was created way back when the old Eastern Europe broke down, and parts of Western Europe wanted to have some sort of agreement, long-term agreement, that they could invest in that part of Europe. So initially, maybe, I'm just saying maybe, it was a good thought, but now, as you mentioned, it's been totally reversed the other way around. And I'm pushing for Sweden to leave it. And I mean, the Greens in Sweden are trying to do that. It's totally 20th century stuff that we shouldn't have anymore, and definitely not into the future.
Absolutely, it's a really horrifying thing to read about. So if you all don't have enough nightmares already, then give the Energy Charter Treaty a Google and find out. So I can see that we're about just over 5 minutes away from the end. Oh, Richard, if you'd like to kick us off on some final words, I think we'll just have final words from all our speakers.
Sorry, I was just going to respond to what Pär had said, that I know that in America, for instance, there's definitely a press so that governments are now finding that companies are kind of trying to sue or take legal action when any new legislation comes in that they perceive as damaging their profits. And this is something that we're going to see increasingly. And having left the EU and therefore looking for deals with other countries, especially the States, we may find that we start hitting up against that sort of thing as well, which is as Rod said, is very dark, really, because it then becomes that governments are unable or feel unable to take action against big companies. And I mean, you see that already with planning applications where councils don't have enough money to fight big corporations trying to plonk inappropriate developments, and it's just on a much bigger scale, and it is undemocratic, and it is a threat to our future. In terms of last words, I mean, I've not been to one of these before. I felt very privileged to take part, especially with two other excellent speakers. So thank you for inviting me. And I hope that I gave you just a few things to think about. You've got my contact details, so if there's any follow-up, you know how to get hold of me. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much, Richard. Rod, if you'd like to do any final thoughts, and also if you'd give us permission to maybe share your artwork after the fact with people who've attended tonight, because I think that in the chat people were very interested to see that, and it's a shame we didn't manage it.
Yeah, I'd be delighted to share a few pictures. They're just, you know, I don't claim any sort of great skill as an artist, but I love it. I love to draw. One of the things that perplexes me around this issue of the overall thing is this question of angels and devils. It seems very simplistic, but when I think of the spectrum of people that I meet and I know and I've talked to and I read about, some people are truly heroic. They convert their whole lives. They bend every fiber of their will towards doing serious personal sacrifice to do the right thing, and to do the right thing in a moral and principled way. And other people have no principles whatsoever. They have no ethics whatsoever. They have no morality whatsoever. And they are the winners, they see themselves as. Now, I don't know how to resolve this because it is so extremely polarized. The only thing that I can think of is that these people who have no principles do need to be stopped, and it is the function of the law to set down the bottom lines. That's all I can say about that.
Thanks, Rod. What a beautifully poetic final few words that we had from you there. Pär, if you can follow that, then that would be great.
No, amazing, Rod. I will try for that to make it illegal to be without ethics, without moral. Yeah, that would be good. I think that would solve quite a lot of our problems. No, but as Richard said, it's of course the first time for me as well to be invited in this and really good. I could tell you a very short story about when the Swedish Greens contacted me some 3 years ago, if I was interested in being on the list of being then possibly voted for the European Parliament. My question to the party back home in Sweden was, is it possible to do that without flying? Because I stopped flying quite a few years ago. And they said, and I think it's true, that no one's ever done that before from Sweden. And then I came to Brussels, and my very good and dear friend and colleague, Alice Bakunke, she had said the same. So suddenly we were 2 Swedish MEPs who refused to fly. Now that is actually a problem, being an MEP, because you are supposed to be in your home country. And as I mentioned during the short chat before the session started, it takes 24 hours to go by train from Brussels to Stockholm. Then we, of course, realized we need these kinds of meetings because we need to be in touch with our voters back home in Sweden. And suddenly, not the least during the pandemic, we've had so many meetings, Zoom and other platforms, which is great. But I have to say that this is even better because I'm having the possibility to have a Zoom meeting being in what I consider actually my second home country, England, and I especially love the southwestern part of England. So it feels like almost being at home now as well. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Pär. That's really nice of you to say. And yes, the Southwest is one of the most beautiful parts of Britain, England, the UK for sure. So we're just going to have a very quick word from Martin Whiteside, who is our Stroud District Green Party coordinator, around some local actions that people can get involved in, and then we will close up for the night. Martin, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you to all the speakers. It's been really interesting. On November the 6th, Saturday, November the 6th, the Global Day of Action for Climate Justice, we're organising a all-party and no particular party vigil for the planet on the High Street, the junction between the High Street and Kendrick Street, from 12 to 12:30. So that's Saturday the 6th, and people can bring placards and banners. So as many people there as possible will be great. On the same day, we'll have a Green Party stall and be doing some visual actions and lobbying actions, all related to COP26. And then the following Saturday is the next Cloud Cafe, which is going to be non-cloud. It'll be face-to-face with speakers in Lansdowne Hall. We've got some really great speakers. We have Carla Denyer, newly elected co-leader of the Green Party, our own Simon Pickering, Juliet Davenport, Chief Executive, founder of Good Energy, and we also have a climate striker coming to speak, and I think we may have Annie Pickering. We're not sure who else. So it'll be really exciting. So that's on Saturday the 13th at 7 o'clock. So feel free to come there, and that'll be a chance. That's immediately after the end of COP26. We'll have a chance to reflect on what was achieved and how we move forward from what was or wasn't achieved. So hope to see everybody there.
Thanks so much, Martin. So many different things to get involved in. We've also posted some petitions and information in the chat. There's also now a donation part of our website if you'd like to donate to Stroud District Green Party for the Cloud Cafes or any other campaigns that we're running, and loads more information about the events on the website as well. Do remember that this is recorded and that you're able to share with any friends or colleagues that you have that weren't able to make it on the night if they're interested in this subject. As always, a huge thank you to our speakers for taking the time out to come and talk to us, and a huge thank you to everyone who continues to support the Cloud Cafe and come to these and have discussions and conversations. I think that, you know, one of the things that's been constantly mentioned this evening is storytelling, and how we can tell the story of, you know, a better life for everybody. I think that that's one of the things that the Greens are often seen as, the party of no, you know, you have to give up this, you have to change this, you have to stop this. But I think that the message from that is that it will create a better life for everybody, and not just, you know, the few, but all of us. And I think that that's one thing that we can take away. So thank you very much. And if everyone would like to put their cameras on and just give us a quick wave so that we know you're all still there. And
thank you very much. You've done a wonderful job.
Thanks, Rod. That's lovely of you to say. Thank you very much. And very nice to see you all. See you again soon.